When I saw the notification on my phone about the card at a hotel we'd never visited together, my heart stopped for a second. It was as if all the excuses he'd been giving me over the past few weeks fell apart at once. The hotel's name flashed on the screen, confirming something I'd avoided believing. I knew it wasn't a coincidence. Deep down, my intuition had been screaming for a long time. I took a deep breath, trying to control my trembling hands as the screen remained open before my eyes. That simple digital history had the weight of an invisible punch, leaving me breathless. And at the same time, it was as if a curtain had been pulled back before me, revealing a truth I'd never wanted to face. His coldness, the delays, it was all starting to make sense. But the pain was immense. In that instant, I realized my world was about to crumble, but also that I couldn't close my eyes to it. Something inside me shattered, but another side awakened, the side of the woman who would no longer accept living in doubt. And believe me, this would be just the first step on a dark journey. I remember when I met him over 20 years ago. He was thoughtful, always had a joke ready, and made me feel special. Our relationship was marked by small gestures, flowers hidden at my work door, goodnight messages that arrived before I went to bed. I believed that man was the right choice for life. In the early days of our marriage, mornings were light, fresh coffee, laughter over trivial things, travel plans that never quite came to fruition. I believed every word he said because there was never any reason to doubt it. He said I was his peace, his foundation, and I believed him because I felt it too. We were complicit in everything, or at least I thought we were. Over time, the routine changed, as it does for any couple. Work, kids, bills, responsibilities. Still, there was affection in the simplest gestures. A quick kiss before leaving, the question, "Do you need anything on the street?" as he was leaving. It was in these little things that I sustained my certainty that we were together for true love. He loved cooking on Sundays. I'd stand in the kitchen, just watching, while he invented new dishes, laughing at his own inventions. At those times I'd think, this man is my safe haven. I never imagined that smile which comforted me so much would one day hide such heavy secrets. I still remember how he talked about the future. When we retire, we'll travel the world, he'd say. I believed in every plan, every promise. I kept everything to my heart, because I thought we were writing the same story together. Today, I realized that perhaps I wrote chapters alone. The trust between us was so natural that I never considered spying on him. I knew his cell phone password, but I never needed to use it. He knew mine too, and it was never a problem. That for me was proof of transparency. But now, looking back, I realize that those who have nothing to hide don't need so many excuses. Family parties were the perfect portrait. He was always by my side, smiling, telling funny stories to everyone. I felt safe, as if we were on the same team. No one would suspect anything because he seemed like the exemplary husband. I believed that too, until the signs began to accumulate. One detail that struck me was when he began to change the way he dressed. New shirts, different perfumes, a preoccupation with his appearance that hadn't existed before. He said it was because of work meetings, that he needed to present himself better. I foolishly applauded the change, not realizing there was another reason. His messages also changed. Before, they were full of affection and details of the day. Then they were limited to, "Okay, be right back, good night." I tried to justify it, thinking it was stress, routine, fatigue, but deep down I already sensed something was off. The absence of words said more than any speech. One night, while we were watching TV, he left his phone on the table. A notification vibrated, but he ran and grabbed it before I could see. I asked if it was urgent, and he replied too quickly, "Nothing much, just work." It was at that moment that I realized a distance had begun to grow between us. Gradually, the bed also became a space of silence. The touches became rare, the hugs less intense. I tried to get closer, but he was always tired or preoccupied. And when he finally relented, it seemed mechanical, as if it were just an obligation. This coldness began to eat away at me, but I still tried to believe his excuses. Meetings with friends also changed. Before, he'd invite me to everything. Then he started going out alone, saying it was work or guy talk. At first I accepted it because I trusted him. But when the schedules didn't match, my mind began to register every detail. The clock seemed to scream out the hours that didn't make sense. Once he came home smelling of a perfume that wasn't mine, a sweet, intense scent that clung to his clothes. I asked him right away and he laughed, saying it must have been in the elevator. I tried to believe it, but deep down something told me that scent had an owner. The excuses became more and more rehearsed. Business trips, endless meetings, dinners I couldn't attend. I tried to participate, suggested dinner together, show up to some event, but there was always a reason why I wasn't there. That's how I realized doors were being closed to me. I started paying attention to details that had previously gone unnoticed. His clothes would arrive from the dry cleaners with different scents. He would change his route home. Suddenly, apps started appearing on his phone, supposedly downloaded by mistake. Every detail became a piece of a larger puzzle. One day, he left his smartwatch charging in the living room. I accidentally checked his heart rate records. Strangely, there were spikes in activity at unusual times, when he said he was in a meeting. It wasn't absolute proof, but to me, it was like a silent scream. My whole body shivered. I didn't tell anyone. I kept every clue, every detail to myself. The pain was mine alone because I knew that if I spoke, many would tell me I was exaggerating. That's the burden of being a mature woman. Knowing your word can easily be dismissed. So I decided to shut up and watch. Sundays, which used to be our time, became days of solitude. He would make up commitments, saying he had urgent matters to attend to. I would sit alone in the living room watching the door close, and inside me hope also slowly faded. It was like watching love slip through your hands, unable to hold on. The trips began to increase. Conferences, meetings, client visits. There was always a plausible justification, and I even tried to believe it. But the frequency was strange, and the way he spoke, increasingly cold, reinforced my suspicions. He didn't understand, but I had already stored enough evidence to avoid making any more mistakes. One night, I sat on the bed and looked at our wedding photo. I remembered the promises made in front of everyone, the emotion in his eyes when he said forever. And there, alone, I realized that forever had expired without me knowing. The pain was so intense I had to bite my lip to keep from screaming. I began to watch silently. I saved receipts, screenshots, schedules. Nothing escaped. My life became a secret investigation, as if I were a spy inside my own home. I smiled on the outside, but inside, each day was a battle against emptiness. And the more I observed, the more certain I became. One time, I decided to accompany him to the door of the building where he said he was having a meeting. He went in, but minutes later, he left through the other side. I stood at a distance, watching, feeling my heart shatter. It was the first time I saw with my own eyes the extent of the farce. There I understood there was no turning back. Nights became unbearable. He slept peacefully, while I stared at the ceiling, trapped in my thoughts. I relived every detail, every excuse, every fake smile. My body ached from holding back tears. And I wondered, how could someone I swore I knew have turned into such a cruel stranger? Until the final blow came, the hotel's history. It wasn't just once, it was several. Specific dates repeated. Everything written down, cold, impersonal. The system doesn't lie. I looked at that information and felt as if the ground had fallen away. The truth I feared was before me, raw and indisputable. The worst part was realizing that, even faced with the proof, my heart still wanted to deny it. I wanted to believe there was an explanation, that maybe it was a mistake, but it wasn't. There was no possible mistake in weekly visits to the same hotel. It was betrayal, naked and clear, and I was alone before it. My eyes burned, but I didn't let a tear fall in front of him. On the outside, I remained calm, as if nothing had happened. But inside, my entire world was crumbling silently. That was the hardest decision, to hold everything together and plan the next step, because I knew I couldn't act without a strategy. I looked in the mirror that night and didn't recognize myself. It felt like a woman who had aged years in just a few days. But along with the wrinkles of pain, a strength was also born. It was as if the truth had given me a new perspective, not that of a victim, but that of a survivor. And there, in front of the mirror, I made a promise to myself. I wouldn't let it be just pain. I would transform every detail, every piece of evidence, into part of an answer he would never forget. because deep down, I knew his downfall was just beginning. What I discovered that night was just the tip of the iceberg. What was yet to come would change not only my life, but his as well, in ways he could never have imagined. That week, I noticed he was increasingly avoiding eye contact. When he spoke to me, he kept his eyes on his phone or watch, as if he were always in a hurry. I felt invisible, reduced to a detail in his routine. That hurt me more than any physical absence. It was like being present, but being treated like a shadow. I decided to observe his habits calmly. He always said he was full of meetings, but when he got home he had no notes, no signs of intellectual fatigue. On the contrary, he was light, almost cheerful. This intrigued me. It was as if his life had two sides, the official one, with me, and the secret one, far from me. One night, I noticed he'd spent more than 20 minutes locked in the bathroom. There was no sound of a shower, no sound of a toothbrush. Just silence, interrupted by the subtle vibrations of his cell phone. When he came out, he was smiling as if he'd received good news. I pretended not to understand, but inside, anger burned. At work, my colleagues talked about absent husbands, and I silently pretended not to identify myself. I guarded my secret like someone hiding an open wound. Outwardly, I smiled, but inside, I felt like each story they told mirrored my own, and this only strengthened me to continue investigating. I also began to notice his spending. He, who had always been frugal, began to have unexpected expenses. Expensive restaurants, purchases in stores we'd never frequented. I'd look at the statement and ask, but he'd say they were client meetings. That wasn't convincing, but I couldn't let my suspicions show. One Friday night, he said he needed to go out for a business dinner. I offered to accompany him, but he declined curtly, almost aggressively. "It's not the place for you. It's just boring work," he said. That tone, dry and impatient, was more revealing than any excuse. While he was away, I decided to organize our things in my home office. Among old papers, I found a parking receipt. The date coincided with the night he'd said he was in another city. The address chilled me. It was right on the street of the hotel listed in the history. I felt a chill run through me. It was no longer just intuition. It was pieces falling into place cruelly. Screwly, every detail confirmed what I'd tried to deny. I stared at that paper, wondering how someone could lie so well, and worse, how I'd believed it for so long. On Sunday, he offered to make lunch as he used to. He tried to act natural, but his look betrayed a certain discomfort. He knew something was changing between us, even if I hadn't said a word. Silence sometimes speaks louder than any accusation. I watched him from afar, chopping vegetables with the same skill as before, but without the lightness I knew. He seemed to be playing a role, trying to maintain a semblance of normalcy. It was then that I realized he no longer cooked for pleasure, but out of obligation to maintain an image. His messages became even colder. "I'll be right there, I'm busy. Talk to you later." Short, emotionless words. I read them and felt like stones, not sentences. And each time I received one, it was as if the chasm between us widened. I no longer recognized the man who wrote to me. His behavior in the bedroom also changed. Before, we'd talk before bed about plans, about the day. Now he lay on his back, cell phone in hand, until it faded. I stared at the ceiling in silence, feeling the emptiness fill the space that had once been filled with complicity. One day, he left his cell phone on the table while he went to the grocery store. I didn't pick it up, but I stared at it like a ticking time bomb. I knew the whole truth lay there. One slip of my tongue would confirm everything, but, strangely, I preferred to wait. It was as if he wanted to give himself away. Deep down, I wanted irrefutable proof. I wanted something no one could deny, not even him. So I held back my anxiety. Every minute of waiting was painful, but I knew I was building something bigger. And somehow, I felt stronger with every detail I retained. One night he came home wearing a new shirt. When I asked, he said it had been a gift from a customer. Except the tag was still in the pocket, with the price clearly visible. He noticed my look and tried to laugh it off, but that detail confirmed it for me. The lie was no longer subtle. Weekends had become a farce. He made up commitments, saying he needed to resolve pending issues. I pretended to believe, but deep down there was no longer any doubt. What kept me going was the idea that soon I would have something so solid he could no longer deny it. One Monday, while tidying his drawer, I found a parking pass for an office building. The problem was, it wasn't his company building. I held the card and felt my heart race. It was another piece in the construction of the truth I so feared. I began writing everything down in a hidden notebook. Dates, times, excuses, receipts. I became a researcher within my own life. Each note was a knife that wounded me, but also a shield that protected me. Because the pain of doubt was worse than the pain of confirmation. He noticed my change in behavior. He asked why I was quieter, more distant. I smiled and said, nothing, just tiredness. He believed it, or pretended to believe it. Little did he know that that silence was the greatest trap I could set. I began to notice the most trivial details. He, who had never cared about the gym, now returned sweaty and smelling good, even at unlikely times. I asked how his workout had gone, and he answered vaguely. I wrote down each answer, knowing it would one day carry weight. One afternoon he called me saying he'd be late. But coincidentally, a friend was at the same restaurant where he supposedly had a meeting. She sent me a photo of the empty place, with no sign of him. When I received the message, my entire body trembled. The lie was becoming increasingly obvious. The most curious thing was his calm. He thought he was untouchable, believing I would never suspect anything. And perhaps that was his fatal mistake, underestimating the woman he'd shared 2 decades of his life with. I knew every gesture, every change of tone. Nothing escaped my gaze. The silence I maintained was calculated. He thought he was deceiving me well, but in truth, I already knew more than he realized. The difference was that I wasn't just looking for a confrontation. I wanted proof so definitive he wouldn't be able to defend himself. The nights turned into long reflections. I thought about everything we'd built, the time I'd invested, the dreams we'd planned, and at the same time, I realized it could all have been a huge hoax. This mixture of pain and lucidity transformed me into a different woman, colder, more strategic. There were times when I wanted to give up the investigation. The pain was too heavy and I thought, wouldn't it be better to pretend I don't know? But the answer soon came, no. Pretending would be living in an emotional prison, and I wasn't willing to lock myself in silence forever. One night, he said he was traveling for work. I wrote down the date, destination, and times. At the same time, I discreetly researched the events in that city. I discovered there was nothing scheduled for that time. That was when I was absolutely certain he was lying, without even bothering to maintain coherence. Deep down, I still sought the strength to face the truth head-on. But each new clue shattered any illusions I had. The man I thought I knew no longer existed. All that remained was the mask, and I knew it would soon fall completely. The silence inside the house became deafening. He tried to make small talk, but I no longer responded in kind. It was as if we were living in parallel universes. He, trapped in the illusion of lies. I, ever closer to revelation. I knew the moment was approaching when nothing could be hidden anymore. My heart ached, but my mind was ready. And when the last piece of the puzzle finally fell into place, I would hold something in my hands that would change everything forever. What came next would be even more devastating, because the next discoveries would leave no room for doubt or excuses. That Tuesday morning, he left early, saying he had a full day of meetings. The thing is, I had already memorized every excuse he offered, and they all sounded the same. This time, something inside me told me I couldn't just wait at home. I decided to observe closely. I got ready as if it were a normal day, but my heart was pounding like never before. I got in the car and drove aimlessly, until I realized I'd unconsciously followed his usual route. I parked far away on a parallel street. And there, I saw his car parked in front of a cafe. He had his cell phone in his hand, waiting for someone. The scene was simple, but it was a shock to me. A few minutes later, a woman approached. Blonde, discreet heels, work clothes. He stood up and opened the car door for her, as if it were an automatic gesture. My entire body froze. I didn't hear what they were saying, but his smile was the same one that had once been mine alone. There were no kisses, no public hugs. Everything was discreet, natural, but the intimacy was in their eyes, in the way they laughed together. Anyone who has ever loved knows when the other person gives something they shouldn't, and in that moment, I needed no further explanation. I saw the betrayal in his eyes. My first instinct was to get out of the car and confront them, but I took a deep breath and held it. I knew I needed more solid proof, something that couldn't be denied. So I simply mentally recorded every detail. The time, the place, the way he leaned in to listen to her. Everything was etched in my memory. I drove home feeling like I was carrying a ton of weight on my shoulders. My hands trembled on the steering wheel, and my thoughts whirled in circles. How could someone who shared half my life act so naturally? What else had he done without me noticing? In the end, he came home as if nothing had happened. He brought flowers, something he hadn't done in months. He said he missed me, trying to mask a plot that was already written. I smiled on the outside, but inside I only thought about the scene I'd witnessed, and the certainty grew heavier. I began to study his behavior almost clinically. The messages he sent always had gaps. When I said I'm home, the location showed another neighborhood. He forgot details, contradicted himself in small stories. They weren't major flaws, but for someone who'd known me for so long, they were glaring. That week, I noticed he was avoiding family gatherings. He always came up with an excuse to miss them. I'm tired, I have to work early tomorrow. It was as if he couldn't stand being in environments where his lies could be questioned by watchful eyes. This, for me, was further confirmation. My patience became my greatest shield. I didn't explode. I didn't confront him. I just kept collecting bits of the truth. The most ironic thing was seeing him act confidently, believing I was still the naive woman I'd been. He didn't realize that every silence I had was a brick in the building of his downfall. One Saturday, he made up a quick trip. He said he needed to sort out personal matters. I saved the license plate number in the parking app, and days later confirmed there was no exit registered for the spot he mentioned. The technology, cold and precise, was working against him. And I grew stronger because of it. I started photographing the receipts I found, a restaurant receipt, a parking receipt, even GPS times on my phone that didn't match. Everything was saved in a hidden folder. Not out of revenge, but because I knew the right time to use it would come. And when it did, he couldn't deny it. Each discovery was a stab wound, but also a scar. I no longer cried like before. Instead, I felt a strange calm, as if the suffering were shielding me. The woman I was fading. A new, cooler, more attentive version was emerging. One night, over dinner at home, he mentioned he was thinking about changing cars. I smiled and asked if it was to impress someone. He laughed nervously and changed the subject. It was at that moment that I realized he could no longer sustain his lies naturally. The cracks were beginning to show. His gaze, once confident, now shifted when I met his gaze. Small tremors in his voice betrayed that something wasn't under control. And the more he tried to appear calm, the closer I realized he was to the absolute truth. It was only a matter of time before the show collapsed. At the gym, I noticed he was spending more time than usual. There were no signs of real training. He'd come back without sweaty clothes, but smelling great. It was obvious the excuse of exercise was just a facade. I simply noted, silently, every detail that escaped his act. He gave me an expensive perfume. He said it was to rekindle our flame. But, curiously, it was the same feminine scent I'd already smelled on his clothes. I received the bottle calmly, but inside, it was like a final blow of irony. He offered me her scent, as if it were my own. Text messages began disappearing from his phone. I understood why the logs were incomplete, with gaps in time. I didn't need to access them to know. Any adult recognizes when something is deliberately deleted. Digital silence often speaks louder than words. One night, while he slept, I stared at his face. He was the same man who promised to love me forever, but he was also the traitor I'd discovered. This duality gnawed at me. How could someone be so familiar and yet so strange at the same time? I no longer knew who was beside me. I began to avoid arguments. He didn't want fights. He didn't want empty accusations. He wanted irrefutable proof. This self-control made me seem cold, but it was necessary. Because, deep down, I knew that once the truth came out, there would be no going back. One Monday morning, he left in a hurry. He'd left his tablet in the living room. The device was flashing with email notifications. I caught a glimpse of confirmed reservations at hotels in the area. Dates, times, prices. My entire body froze. It was the proof I'd been waiting for, clearer than any other. I stored the information away without showing it. I continued my day as normal, as if I hadn't seen it. He came back, kissed me on the cheek, and asked how my day had been. I responded matter-of-factly, but inside all I could think was, "Little do you know your charade is over." That night, I lay awake for hours. I thought about every detail, every lie, every excuse. It was like a movie playing in my mind. The difference was that this one didn't have a happy ending. I knew I would soon have to choose, confront or expose. But it wasn't time yet. I wanted him to feel safe, confident, so the fall would be greater. And, in a way, I wanted to see how far he would go. How far is someone capable of sustaining so many lies without realizing the trail they leave? I began to change too. I took better care of myself, styled my hair, wore clothes that made me feel powerful. Not for him, but for myself. I needed to remind myself that I was still strong, that I still had value. And every time I looked in the mirror, I saw a less fragile, more determined woman. Silence became my greatest weapon. I smiled when he lied, pretended to believe him, and that made him even more confident. He didn't know that, by believing he was deceiving, he was actually sinking deeper and deeper. And I, patient, waited for the right moment. It was at that point that I realized it wasn't just pain anymore. It was strategy. My life had become a silent game, where every move counted. And when the last piece was placed, there would be no turning back. What I found on that tablet was just the beginning. The true revelation was yet to come, and it would be capable of destroying not only our marriage, but the image he had always maintained in front of everyone. The day after the discovery on the tablet, my routine seemed the same, but inside, everything had already changed. The coffee smelled the same, the house the same silence, but I saw every detail differently. Even the sound of his key in the door now seemed false. I no longer saw a home, but a stage of lies. As he talked about the city traffic and how demanding work was, I just watched him. It was impressive how he managed to maintain the act without stuttering. His hands moved naturally, his gestures rehearsed, but the eyes, the eyes always give it away. And his no longer held the same steadfastness. I noticed he was increasing his physical contact at home. He'd touch my shoulder, compliment my hair, ask if I was okay. Before, these gestures would have made me smile, but now they felt like rehearsal. It was as if he wanted to compensate at home for the guilt he carried outside. For me, every touch was a reminder of betrayal. That Friday, he said he'd be staying late at the office. I smiled and wished him good luck. Minutes later, I grabbed my bag and headed to the area around the hotel I already knew by heart. I waited in the car, at a distance, trying to control the anxiety that was eating away at me. It was my chance to confirm everything. It didn't take long. I saw his car park in front of the hotel. He hurried out, looked around, and went in. Minutes later, the same woman I'd seen at the cafe arrived. They both entered together, discreetly, as if they already knew the script by heart. My body froze, but my gaze remained steady. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just mentally registered every movement. That scene was more powerful than any words. And for the first time, I didn't just feel pain. I also felt a strange strength, as if I finally had in my hands what would free me from an invisible prison. I waited almost an hour in the car. I watched them leave together, laughing, exchanging glances that an ordinary couple would recognize as intimate. There was no kiss, no hug, but there was no need. Those who love know how to read the signs, and those were all too clear. He was no longer mine, even though he was right beside me. I returned home before him as if nothing had happened. I set the table for dinner, put the food in the oven. When he arrived, he hugged me, said he was exhausted. I smiled and replied, "I imagine." My calm confused him, but that was my greatest asset. I began to think about how many times this had happened. How many Fridays, how many apologies, how many hotels. The betrayal didn't start there, it wasn't recent. It was something nurtured, repeated, consolidated. And the cruelest thing was realizing that he was able to come home and lie in our bed as if nothing had happened. Sometimes I found myself imagining the details. What they talked about, what they laughed at, what nicknames they used. It was silent but necessary torture. Because every thought helped me move away emotionally. The more I faced the pain, the more clarity I gained to not hold on to the past. I started to analyze not only what he did, but what he didn't do. The affection that was missing, The effort that disappeared, the indifference in small things. Love is not destroyed suddenly, it dies in detail. And I finally saw that ours had been dead for a long time. One night, while he was talking about the company's new project, I stared at him. He spoke with such conviction that he almost made me believe it. But I already knew that those words were empty, just another disguise. The most impressive thing was how he seemed to believe his own lies. I knew that for many I should confront him immediately. But I didn't just want a scandal. I wanted strategy. I wanted every lie to be debunked with evidence. Because deep down, I knew that the betrayal wasn't just about me. He deceived his family, his friends, everyone who believed in his perfect image. I started saving digital copies of the tests. Photos of invoices, application prints, location records. Everything in a password-protected folder, in an email he would never discover. I was no longer just the cheated wife. I had become the guardian of a truth that, when revealed, would change everything. He continued to act as if nothing had happened. I talked about future trips, house renovation plans, even a birthday party I wanted to organize. I smiled and waved, but inside I just thought, how can you look me in the eye and lie so easily? The weight of the truth was unbearable, but it also gave me strength. I knew I could no longer live in that illusion, and every day my silence stopped being just pain and turned into power. Because when the moment came, I would have something in my hands that he could never deny. At the gym, I saw from afar when he received a message. The quick smile on his face was unmistakable. It was the same smile I knew from the early days, but now it wasn't for me. Seeing that hurt more than any material proof, because smiling is giving soul. And he had already given his to someone else. I started to rethink my entire life. How many times have I ignored signs because I was too trusting? How many times have I let it go because I believed love was enough? The truth is that I closed my eyes to not see. And now, open to reality, I could no longer go back. The following days were a mix of normality and torment. He laughed at dinners, told stories to his friends, hugged his children as if he were the same man as before. But I knew it was all a facade. And this duality ate at me, living with an actor in my own home. One Saturday, we were at a family lunch. He talked excitedly about work and answered questions confidently. Everyone admired him. I, in silence, watched. No one there had any idea of the theater that was hidden behind that man. And I asked myself, will someone ever see what I see? My body began to show signs of the weight I was carrying. Insomnia, lack of appetite, constant headaches. The lie doesn't just hurt the heart, it makes the body sick. Still, I stood my ground, because I knew I needed to resist until the right moment to act. One night I picked up my old diary. I flipped through the pages and saw notes from when we were in love. Plans, dreams, little happiness. I closed the notebook and realized that that story no longer existed. Everything had turned to dust, to memories distorted by a cruel reality. He started to notice my distance. He asked if I was okay, tried to get closer. I responded calmly, but without emotion. He felt like something had changed, but he didn't have the courage to ask what it was. Maybe, deep down, he already knew that I had found out. Women's perfumes continued to appear on his clothes. More and more frequent, more and more brazen. It wasn't carelessness, it was certainty of impunity. He believed that I would never have the courage to question. Little did he know that I already had all the answers saved. I started walking alone in the late afternoon, something we used to do together. These walks became my refuge, a space to organize my thoughts. At every step I wondered what to do with everything I discovered. The answer wasn't yet clear, but one thing was certain. I wouldn't go back. The nights were the worst. I heard her calm breathing next to me, while my mind didn't stop. He slept like someone who was not to blame, and I, awake, carried the pain and the weight of the truth alone. It was such a cruel contrast that it suffocated me. I knew that at some point I would have to make a decision. Continue in silence, confront, expose, but it wasn't time yet. My instinct told me there was more to discover, that I hadn't gotten to the bottom of this story yet. And, strangely enough, I was ready to face whatever came. His every look, his every word was now an enigma. I no longer saw him as a husband, but as an investigator. Every gesture was a clue, every absence was proof. and I was getting closer and closer to putting all the pieces together. The most painful thing was realizing that he didn't show any regret. Not a hesitation, not a hesitation. He followed his double life calmly, as if it were his right. This revolted me even more, but it also gave me clarity. It wasn't just betrayal, it was complete disrespect. I no longer expected explanations. I didn't want an apology. I just wanted the naked truth, so that no one would ever say it was my imagination. I was ready to face reality, no matter how harsh it was. And it was at this point that an unexpected discovery dawned on me, bringing to light something even more disturbing than I could have imagined. That unexpected discovery happened in a banal way. While organizing the house documents, I found a forgotten folder at the bottom of the closet. It was a place that only he used to deal with because of the bills and work papers. Curiosity made me open it, and inside there was something I didn't expect. A set of paper receipts from different hotels, all recent. My heart sank when I saw the dates. They coincided exactly with the days when he said he was on business trips. It was no longer just the hotel I already knew, there were several. He had a pattern, a system, almost like a weekly ritual. Realizing that was like getting another blow to the stomach. The feeling was of multiplied betrayal. It wasn't an isolated error, it wasn't a slip-up. It was repetition, coldness, organization. He had made infidelity part of his routine, like scheduling meetings or making appointments. This naturalness scared me more than anything else. I closed the folder carefully, kept it in the same place, and returned to the room as if nothing had happened. On the outside, I was calm. Inside, there was a turmoil that almost made me fall apart. The strength that kept me standing was the certainty that, now, I had something impossible to contest. That night, he arrived smiling, bringing a dessert as a gift. He said he had remembered me during the day. I thanked him calmly, but the irony consumed me inside. How could someone share a dessert with me after sharing a bed with someone else hours before? With his every word, I saw layers of falsehood. He talked about his routine at work, complained about his boss, made jokes, but I no longer heard like I used to. It was as if the sentences had no weight, just noise. The only thing I heard was the constant lie, like an echo in the mind. The next day I decided to save digital copies of the papers I found. I photographed every receipt, every signature, every detail. I put together an organized folder with dates and locations. I knew that it could be useful in several ways, whether for a direct confrontation or for a future process. He, in turn, seemed even more confident. He sent affectionate messages in the middle of the day, as if he were in love again. But I knew it was a scam. It was his way of alleviating the guilt, or maybe just maintaining the image of a devoted husband. For me, it was no longer just an act. At work, I started to get distracted frequently. My mind was always elsewhere, reliving scenes, calculating possibilities. I smiled at my colleagues, but deep down I just wanted to go home and continue investigating. My body was present, but my spirit was at war. He arranged a dinner at a restaurant we used to frequent. He said he wanted to relive the old days. During dinner, he talked about future trips and birthday plans. I listened to him, but every word seemed like a cruel joke. The table that was once a symbol of love was now a stage for cynicism. At home, I noticed that he always left his cell phone facing down. Before, it was automatic to leave it on the table without worrying. Now, it was a constant gesture. I watched silently, and every time he did it, it was like he was signing a confession of his own betrayal. His clothes started to show even more. Small lipstick stains on light collars, which he tried to disguise by saying they were pen. I didn't question, I just observed. I kept every detail because I knew that, in the future, each test would have its weight. I started taking more care of my appearance, not for him, but for me. I started wearing clothes that made me feel alive. I started exercising again. I went back to doing my hair like I used to. Little by little, I realized that it wasn't just silent revenge. It was also a way of reminding myself that I wasn't finished. He began to notice this change. He made comments like, "You look different, more beautiful." I just smiled. Little did he know that this change had nothing to do with him, but rather with the strength I rediscovered within myself. The strength of not accepting being deceived forever. One afternoon, I decided to pass by the hotel again. My heart was racing just driving there. and to my surprise, his car was parked at the door. It was mid-afternoon, a time when he said he was in a meeting at the office. This scene was more devastating than any paper evidence. I didn't have the courage to go in. I just stayed in the car, staring at the entrance. People passed by, the street continued as normal, but for me it was as if the world had stopped. The scene was too clear to ignore. And it was at that moment that I realized I was no longer trapped in doubt. That night, he arrived with a rehearsed excuse. He said that the meeting had been tiring, that he barely had time for lunch. I smiled and asked, "Was it productive?" He responded without hesitation, believing he had convinced me. But to me, it was just another lie for the collection. I started thinking about what to do with all of that. The confrontation seemed inevitable, but I still didn't know the right moment. I wanted more than just to scream the truth. I wanted him to feel the weight of every lie, every detail he tried to hide. He started to appear more attentive. I bought flowers, planned dinners, paid compliments. Maybe it was guilt, maybe it was fear of losing control. But for me, it was already too late. No flower erased the hotel nights, no compliments erased the saved receipts. The sleepless nights continued. I turned over in bed, looking at the ceiling while he slept peacefully. It was a painful contrast, me carrying the weight of the truth, and him, immersed in the comfort of his own lie. This made me question to what extent someone can live in so much falsehood without losing themselves. I decided to share my suspicions with a trusted friend. She listened to me in silence, with tears in her eyes. He just said, "You deserve better than this." His words echoed in my mind, reinforcing the idea that I couldn't continue to be stuck with someone who deceived me like that. Deep down, I knew I wasn't ready to expose everything. But she was no longer the same woman. I saw myself stronger, more lucid, more aware. The pain had transformed me into someone who no longer accepted being deceived into silence. At a family dinner, I noticed he was restless. His cell phone vibrated all the time, and he left the table to answer it. Everyone thought they were work calls, but I knew the truth. Every absence of his was another wound that I carried in silence. I started planning a future without him. I didn't say it out loud, but I was already building this idea inside of me. I thought about what it would be like to live alone, how I would rebuild my life. It was painful but also freeing to imagine that I could be happy without relying on his lies. One day, while shopping, I saw a couple laughing in the supermarket aisle. He looked at her with so much affection that it reminded me of what it was like in the beginning with my husband. It was a shock to realize that that kind of love no longer existed between us, and for the first time, I felt like I was ready to let go. Betrayal wasn't just a wound to the heart, it was a rupture with my own history. But at the same time, it made me understand that I didn't need to live in the past. I had a choice. And that choice was increasingly clear before me. He still had no idea how much I knew. I believed I had everything under control. But I already had enough evidence in hand to dismantle his charade, and inside me a voice grew. The time will come. What I found in that folder was just the surface. What would come next would not only confirm the betrayal, but would reveal something even more cruel and impossible to ignore. After that folder of receipts, my mind went on high alert. Any detail became a clue. I no longer walked around the house as a wife, but as an investigator. My eyes scanned every corner, every forgotten object, every jacket pocket. It was painful, but I needed to face the truth head-on. One morning, while organizing the clothes he left in the basket, I found a folded business card. It was from an expensive restaurant, with a romantic atmosphere, one of those we never went to together. The card was stained with red lipstick. I held that piece of paper like someone holding dynamite. The restaurant was just a few kilometers from home. I remembered how many times he said he was in long meetings in that same region. It was like joining dots on an invisible map. He not only cheated, but he did it too close, as if he was sure of my blindness. That night, when he got home, he smiled and kissed me on the cheek. I closed my eyes, but the smell of feminine perfume was there again. It was impossible to ignore. The kiss that once meant love now tasted like betrayal. And I kept silent, because I knew the game wasn't over yet. I started recording his every move on a hidden calendar. Dates, times, excuses. Next to it, I wrote down the physical evidence I collected. The diary became a dossier. In each page was an open wound, but also a shield against any attempt at manipulation. He started to notice that I was different. He asked if I was tired, if there was something wrong at work. I responded with short sentences, and he seemed to believe me. But what he didn't know was that my silence wasn't fragility. It was strategy. One Saturday, he said he needed to resolve something at the office. I made up an excuse and went after it. I followed his car in a safe distance. The destination was not work, but another hotel in the city. Seeing it with my own eyes was devastating, even though I already knew the truth. I sat in the car, a few meters from the entrance, and watched. Time didn't seem to pass. His hands were sweating, his chest was burning, but I didn't cry. I just stared at the facade of that hotel as if recording every brick in my memory. That scene would be my turning point. I went home before him, tidied the living room, and left everything in place. When he walked in the door complaining about the tiring work, I just smiled. His hypocrisy became unbearable, but still I held on tight. Silence at this point was no longer a burden, it was a weapon. The next day I sat with a cup of coffee and looked out the window at the horizon. I thought about everything we experienced. Birthdays, births, achievements. Everything seemed distant, almost irrelevant in the face of the current farce. What was left of the man I knew? The answer was harsh. Just a mask. I decided to look for old credit card statements. I discovered spending in lingerie stores, always on dates close to business trips. That was like a cruel confirmation. He not only lied, but also invested time and money in a parallel life. In the afternoon, he arrived with gifts for me. A new bag. I held the package and smiled, but inside me the contempt was overwhelming. That wasn't love. It was guilt, it was an attempt to buy my silence, but I was no longer for sale. I began to wonder how long I had been living this lie. Would it have been a year? 2? Maybe more? This doubt hurt more than any proof. Because I realized that part of my life was stolen by someone who never deserved my love. One night he left his cell phone on the bedside table while he was taking a shower. The screen lit up and I saw a notification. I can't wait for tomorrow. The heart raced. I didn't need to open the message. That sentence alone already had the weight of a confession. He got out of the shower, talked about the day as if nothing was wrong. I just listened, but inside I had already given up all hope. The man who shared the bed with me was no longer my husband. He was a stranger. I started planning my future more and more without him. I discreetly researched lawyers, looked at housing options, and even thought about dividing everything fairly. It wasn't just anger, it was also rationality. Because I knew that at some point, I would have to cut the bond for good. Daily coexistence became unbearable. The mere sound of his voice reminded me of the lies. Every word felt like poison. I needed self-control to not explode, but I knew I needed to resist a little longer. One day, during lunch, he received a call and left the table. I watched from afar through the restaurant window. His smile while talking on his cell phone wasn't work-related. It was the smile of intimacy, the same one that was once mine, that hurt more than any receipt. In the evening, I decided not to have dinner with him. He said he wasn't hungry, that he needed to rest. He tried to insist, but I didn't give in. For the first time, I felt like I was taking back some control. Small gestures of refusal were signs that I was no longer the same. I started to notice his silences. When I asked something simple, it took me a while to answer, as if I needed to construct a sentence. This only confirmed that he was trapped in a web of lies. The more he talked, the more fragile he became. I started using my intuition as a compass. She always warned me, but I ignored it. Now, not anymore. Every time something seemed strange, I wrote it down. And without fail, the pieces fell into place afterwards. It was as if my body knew before my mind did. He still tried to maintain the image of an exemplary husband in front of others. He brought flowers to family gatherings, made jokes, showed affection in public. But for me, it was all theater, and I watched the performance as a spectator of something predictable. In silence, I realized that he was beginning to contradict himself. He said he had been to a place, but he would forget it and tell another version days later. It was at that moment that I saw his mask crack. And that crack was my hope. The cruelest thing was realizing that, even in the face of everything, I still remembered the man I met. There were still remnants of love in me, but they were dying with each lie. Loving and hating at the same time is a weight that no one should carry. Deep down, I knew the full truth was about to explode. He wouldn't be able to sustain it much longer, and I was ready, with all the evidence in hand. One rainy night, I sat on the couch and faced the window. The sound of rain was intense, but it still seemed smaller than the noise in my mind. I knew the moment was coming, and when it arrived, nothing would be able to erase the impact. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. I was tired, but also determined. There was no turning back. And what was about to happen would change not just my marriage, but the entire fabric of our lives. It was at this point that I realized something even more disturbing. The betrayal wasn't just a secret between us. It was already beginning to leak out into the world around it, reaching people who should never have been involved. It was at a family lunch that I noticed the signs starting to overflow outside our house. He was restless, playing on his cell phone all the time, covering it with forced smiles. My sister-in-law gave me a curious look, asking if everything was okay. He responded too quickly, and that excess of explanation attracted attention. I remained silent, watching. The table full of laughter and conversation seemed like a distant scene to me. What mattered was the way he avoided eye contact, as if he was hiding something even from his own brothers. For the first time, I realized that his mask wasn't fooling everyone. Days later, I received a call from a close friend. Her voice was full of hesitation. "I saw your husband in a restaurant, but I didn't want to believe it." My heart skipped a beat, even though I already knew. I just asked who he was with. On the other end of the line, silence. Then the answer, "I wasn't alone." Its confirmation, coming from someone who had no reason to lie, was like a punch. The betrayal was no longer just our secret. Other people were starting to notice. This gave me a mixture of shame and relief. Shame for having been deceived, relief for not actually being alone anymore. He came home that day bringing flowers. I almost laughed at the irony. While everyone was starting to get suspicious, he still believed that a bouquet would be enough to erase tracks. I received the flowers, I thanked them, but inside I felt the weight of an exposed fake. That night at dinner, he tried to start a conversation about future plans. He talked about traveling, about new achievements. I just watched thinking, how many of these dreams have been shared with someone else? The food seemed to have no flavor, as if even the seasoning had been contaminated by the lie. I started to notice our mutual friends. Some looked at me with pity, others looked away. Their silence said more than any words. I knew that rumors were circulating, discreet but already present. The betrayal stopped being intimate and became a social rumor. My body reacted to this. His hands shook in social encounters. His breathing became heavy when someone asked about him. I responded with short sentences, but inside I felt the shame that wasn't mine. I didn't make a mistake, but I was the one carrying the weight of the exposure. One day at the gym, I overheard two women commenting on a married man who always showed up with the same lover. They didn't mention names, but the chill in my spine made me understand that the story was already circulating in places where I least imagined it. The betrayal had stopped being a secret. I returned home with tears in my eyes, but without crying. I no longer had tears, just a feeling of revolt. How could he be so careless? How could she risk destroying not just her marriage, but her entire family's reputation? He didn't seem to notice. He continued to act as if nothing was happening. He invented elaborate excuses, arrived late with repeated stories. Maybe I believed that no one would have the courage to tell me. But the truth is that people saw it, they knew it, they just didn't say it out loud. Little by little, I realized that it wasn't just me who was being cheated on. It was also our story, our family, our friends. His every lie spilled over onto everyone. And that realization hurt more than any hotel test. Because betrayal was no longer just intimate, it was public. I began to wonder if he was aware of what he was doing. Did he believe he could sustain two lives forever? Or did he no longer care about the consequences? These questions haunted me in the early hours of the morning, as I stared at the ceiling next to someone who was sleeping peacefully. One night, during a meeting with friends, he contradicted himself. He said he was in a town the same day someone else had seen him at a local bar. An uncomfortable silence took over the circle, and I just took a deep breath. The lie was being exposed in front of others, not just me. On the way home in the car, he talked endlessly about how people like to invent I just stared out the window, letting the words flow like noise. It was incredible how he still tried to maintain control even when the mask had already fallen. At the company, I heard discreet comments too. Colleagues whispered about his frequent absences, about trips that didn't make sense. The man who prided himself on his impeccable reputation was now beginning to be questioned. It was like watching a castle crumble stone by stone. With each new clue, my anger turned into coldness. It was no longer just pain, it was strategy. He didn't realize it, but his every movement was yet another proof against himself. I just collected it, silently, waiting for the right moment to use it. Messages deleted from cell phones have become even more frequent, but I no longer needed to see them. His actions said it all. The look shining after a call, the quick smile when responding to notifications. Small details that only those who love one day noticed. At family gatherings, veiled comments increased. My mother, in silence, looked at me deeply, as if she wanted to ask but respected my time. I felt the weight of carrying everything alone, but I also knew that I was close to a definitive decision. He still believed he was in control. I thought I was oblivious, that my family didn't know, that my friends believed, but every false gesture of his was another visible crack. It was only a matter of time before the farce fell apart completely. One afternoon, a friend sent me a photo. He was sitting in a cafe with the same woman as before. The image was clear, impossible to deny. When I saw it, I felt a mixture of relief and pain. Relief at having definitive proof, pain at having visual confirmation. I kept the photo along with the other records. It was the missing piece to the puzzle. There was no more room for doubt. I had the whole truth in my hands. What was left now was to decide what to do with it. He continued living normally, believing his own lie. But I no longer saw him as a husband. I saw him as a character in decline, about to be unmasked in front of everyone. And that, in a way, gave me the strength to continue. I started thinking about the impact the revelation would have. Friends, family, work. He would lose not only trust but also respect. And this fall would only be the result of the choices he made, not mine. That night, I sat on the couch and watched him from afar. He watched TV, laughing at some program. And I, in silence, thought, if you knew what I had in store, I wouldn't laugh like that. The power was no longer in his hands. It was mine. My body still hurt, my mind still struggled, but I was no longer the same woman I was at the beginning of this story. Betrayal destroyed me, but it also rebuilt me into something stronger. I knew the end was coming, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. And it was just when I thought I had seen everything that new evidence emerged, revealing not only infidelity, but an even darker and more devastating side to this story. One day, while looking at my home computer, I accidentally found a forgotten email in the trash. It was a reservation confirmation at another hotel, but this time with her name written as companion. It was no longer a thinly disguised secret, it was an official record of the hoax. My heart raced, but at the same time I felt a strange calm. There was no more room for doubt, excuses, or justifications. He wasn't just cheating. He was assuming this relationship in roles that could be seen by anyone. I looked at him that night, sitting on the couch, and I saw someone who was no longer part of my life. His image seemed distant, almost unrecognizable. I knew that test would be a turning point. While he slept, I remained silent, watching. My mind was no longer focused on the past or the pain. I was already thinking about the next step, the impact that this revelation would have on everyone. The next morning, I woke up with one certainty: I would no longer carry this weight alone. Betrayal was no longer just a secret behind four walls, it was a wound that bled in front of everyone. And I wasn't willing to hide scars that weren't made by my choices. I looked at him and realized that silence no longer defined me. I wasn't the deceived woman, I was the woman who survived, who saw every detail and still remained standing. The truth no longer scared me, it strengthened me. And I leave you with this reflection. How many women will still ignore such clear signs? And if it were you, what would you do? Would you tell someone, or keep it inside until you couldn't take it anymore?